The greatest lie ever sold to the wounded soul is that healing your inner child means returning to innocence. That somewhere buried beneath years of pain and disappointment lives a pure, untouched version of yourself, waiting to be rescued, waiting to be held, waiting to be loved back into wholeness. But what if I told you that this child you're trying to heal never existed? What if the very concept of your inner child has become another prison? Another way to avoid the terrifying truth of who you actually are. You've been taught to excavate your past like an archaeologist searching for buried treasure. To dig through the rubble of your childhood, seeking that golden moment when you were supposedly whole. You light candles for meditation sessions. You journal about your mother's criticism. You hold teddy bears and speak in soft voices to the wounded little person inside. And still, you remain fractured. Still, you carry the same patterns. Still, you find yourself reacting from that place of desperate need, that bottomless hunger that no amount of self-compassion seems to fill. The therapy industry has built an empire on this lie. Thousands of hours spent in circles, sharing stories of abandonment and neglect, as if the retelling could somehow undo what was done, as if understanding your patterns could free you from them, as if knowing why you're broken could make you whole. But knowledge without transformation is just sophisticated suffering, and transformation cannot happen while you're clutching the very wounds you claim you want to heal. Because you've been healing the wrong child. You've been nurturing the symptom instead of recognizing the disease. You've been feeding the very adaptations that keep you small, calling it love. From the moment you drew your first breath, the world began its systematic dismantling of your essential nature. Not through malice, but through the unconscious transmission of fear dressed as love, control disguised as protection, limitation masquerading as safety. Your parents, drowning in their own unhealed wounds, taught you that love was conditional, that acceptance required performance, that your natural impulses were dangerous, selfish, wrong. They didn't mean to wound you. They were simply passing down the same poison they had swallowed from their parents, who received it from theirs. In an unbroken chain of unconscious suffering stretching back generations, the child you mourn was never allowed to exist. What you call your inner child is actually the accumulation of adaptations, survival strategies, and desperate attempts to earn love. It's not innocence you carry, it's the scar tissue of innocence murdered before it could fully bloom. You learned to read the emotional weather of every room you entered. You became a master of camouflage, shifting your personality to match whatever would keep you safe, loved, accepted. You developed an exquisite sensitivity to rejection, abandonment, criticism, not because you were naturally fragile, but because your survival depended on it. You learned to shrink yourself to fit into spaces too small for your soul. You learned to silence your voice so others wouldn't leave. You learned to carry everyone else's emotions because your own were deemed too much, too intense, too inconvenient for the fragile adults around you. The adults who were supposed to teach you how to be human were themselves broken children in grown-up bodies, unconsciously recreating the same dynamics that wounded them. They passed on their limitations as wisdom, their fears as protection, their emotional numbness as maturity. Your mother, overwhelmed by her own unprocessed grief, taught you that emotions were dangerous by shutting down every time you expressed intensity. Your father, terrified of his own vulnerability, showed you that strength meant disconnection by disappearing behind work, alcohol, or silence whenever life demanded presence. Your teachers rewarded compliance and punished curiosity, training you to seek approval rather than truth. The religious institutions promised salvation through self-denial, teaching you that your natural desires were sinful, that suffering was noble, that sacrifice was the highest virtue. The educational system taught you to memorize rather than think, to conform rather than create, to compete rather than collaborate. Every authority figure in your young life was unconsciously invested in keeping you small, manageable, predictable. You absorbed their anxiety like a sponge, their limitations like gospel, their fears like inheritance. You learned to read micro-expressions before you could read books, to sense emotional storms before they broke, to become whatever each situation demanded for survival. You became a shapeshifter, a chameleon, a master of adaptation, and called it love. The tragedy is not that this happened to you. The tragedy is that you're still doing it to yourself decades later, in the name of healing. You've internalized their voices so completely that you no longer need them to limit you. You do it yourself, automatically, unconsciously, calling it self-care. And now, decades later, you're trying to heal by returning to that same wounded place, speaking sweetly to the very adaptations that have kept you small. You're trying to comfort the prison guard instead of burning down the prison. You're treating the symptom as if it were the patient. The child you're trying to heal was never real. It was an emergency response system, a collection of coping mechanisms, dressed up as personality. And you cannot heal what was never whole to begin with. The German philosopher Nietzsche spoke of the need to become who we are, not who we were conditioned to be. But this becoming requires a kind of psychological courage that few possess. The willingness to let the false self die completely, to walk through the fire of authenticity without the comfort of familiar patterns. Your so-called inner child work has become another form of spiritual materialism, another way to avoid the fundamental truth of existence, that you are not here to return to some mythical state of purity, but to forge yourself into something entirely new, something that has never existed before in the history of the universe. The existentialists understood what modern psychology has forgotten, that human beings are condemned to be free, thrust into existence without a predetermined nature, forced to create themselves moment by moment through their choices. There is no essential self to return to. There is only the self you choose to become. Yet the healing industry keeps selling you the fantasy of recovery, as if you were a broken vase that could be glued back together, restored to its original form. But you are never a vase. You are molten metal, constantly reshaping, constantly becoming, constantly capable of transformation so radical that your past becomes unrecognizable. The universe doesn't care about your childhood wounds. Nature doesn't pause its relentless becoming to tend to your hurt feelings. The sun doesn't withhold its light because it once lived in darkness. It burns, it gives, it transforms everything it touches, not from a place of healing, but from the recognition of its own inexhaustible power. The oak tree doesn't mourn the acorn it once was. The butterfly doesn't try to heal its relationship with the caterpillar. They understand something that humans have forgotten, that true transformation requires the complete dissolution of what came before. Yet you sit in circles, clutching photographs of your younger self, trying to negotiate with ghosts. You've turned your pain into an identity, your wounds into a spiritual practice, your brokenness into a badge of honor that grants you membership in the community of the wounded. But what if healing isn't about going backward? What if it's about going so far forward that the past becomes irrelevant? What if the only child that matters is the one you're capable of becoming, the one who doesn't carry anyone else's limitations, including your own? True healing begins when you stop trying to save the child and start creating the adult you were always meant to become, not the adult who compensates for childhood wounds, but the one who renders them meaningless through the sheer force of authentic self-creation. This is not about positive thinking, or affirmations, or any of the other spiritual bypassing techniques that promise transformation without the inconvenience of actual change. This is about the radical recognition that you are not your history. You are not the sum of what was done to you or what you failed to receive. You are pure creative potential, temporarily disguised as a wounded human being. The child you need to nurture isn't the one trapped in memory. It's the one emerging right now in this moment as you read these words. The one who dares to dream beyond the boundaries of what your family said was possible. The one who refuses to shrink to make others comfortable. The one who burns with the recognition of their own unlimited nature. This emerging self doesn't heal. It creates. It doesn't seek love. It generates love from the overflow of its own fullness. It doesn't ask permission. It gives itself permission to exist without apology, without explanation, without the need for anyone's validation or approval. Like the sun that doesn't question its right to shine, this new self operates from abundance, not scarcity, from power, not pleading, from the certainty of its own worth, not the desperate hope that someone else might finally see it, validate it, love it enough to make it feel whole. You stop asking, "What did I not receive?" and start asking, "What am I here to give?" You stop excavating the past and start architecting the future. You stop trying to heal the wounded child and start birthing the magnificent adult who was always waiting in the wings, watching, learning, preparing for this moment of recognition. This is the birth of the authentic self, not the one shaped by trauma and adaptation, but the one that emerges when you finally stop apologizing for your existence. When you recognize that your sensitivity is not a wound to be healed, but a gift to be treasured. That your intensity is not a problem to be managed, but a force to be channeled. That your depth is not a burden to be carried, but a well to be drawn from. You begin to understand that every challenge you faced, every betrayal you endured, every moment of abandonment you survived, was not evidence of your brokenness, but proof of your resilience. Not a sign that you were unloved, but confirmation that you are, in fact, unbreakable. This new self moves through the world like a force of nature, not because it has conquered its wounds, but because it has transcended the very concept of woundedness. It doesn't carry the past like baggage, it carries it like wisdom. It doesn't hide its scars, it wears them like battle honors earned in the war for authenticity. When you operate from this place, relationships transform. You stop attracting people who need you to be small so they can feel big. You stop giving your power away to anyone who reminds you of your parents. You stop seeking external validation because you found the only approval that matters, your own. You become dangerous to systems built on keeping people wounded and dependent. You threaten the entire economy of healing because you no longer need to be fixed. You challenge every institution that profits from your sense of inadequacy because you have remembered your own completeness. The wounded world will try to pull you back into familiar patterns. Your family will resist your transformation because it mirrors their own stagnation. Your friends may distance themselves because your growth makes them uncomfortable with their own lack of it. Society will label you selfish, arrogant, ungrateful, anything to get you to shrink back to a manageable size. But once you taste this freedom, this aliveness, this authentic power, there is no going back to sleep. You would rather be alone, in your truth, than surrounded by people who only love your mask. But even this magnificent self, this radiant being you're becoming, must eventually learn the wisdom of silence, must understand that the highest form of creation sometimes requires the complete dissolution of the creator. There comes a moment in every genuine transformation when you must stop talking about your healing, stop performing your growth, stop showcasing your spiritual evolution. When you must retreat into the fertile darkness of pure being, beyond labels, beyond identity, beyond even the story of your own magnificence. The river doesn't announce its flowing. The mountain doesn't proclaim its strength. The stars don't justify their brilliance. They simply are, in their own perfect silence, embodying their essence without explanation or justification. This is the paradox that destroys most seekers. The very self you fought so hard to create must itself be surrendered. The adult you became, the healing you achieved, the transformation you underwent, all of it must be released into the vastness from which it emerged. This is not a return to brokenness, but an advancement into wholeness so complete that it includes and transcends all previous stages of development. It's the recognition that even your healed self is just another mask, another role, another temporary expression of something much more fundamental. In this silence you discover what was never wounded, and therefore never needed healing. What was never lost and therefore never needed finding. What was never broken and therefore never needed fixing. The presence that has been watching all along, through the wounded child, through the healing adult, through every story you've told yourself about who you are. This presence doesn't have an inner child because it was never separate from its own essence. It doesn't need healing because it was never sick. It doesn't seek transformation because it is the very source from which all transformation emerges. You begin to laugh at the cosmic joke of it all, how you spent years trying to heal something that was never actually broken, trying to find something that was never actually lost. trying to become something you always already were. The silence becomes your teacher now, showing you that all the noise of healing and growth and becoming was just the sound of resistance to what is. That peace doesn't come from fixing yourself, but from recognizing that there was never anything to fix. If these words have stirred something ancient in your soul, if you feel the tremor of recognition beneath the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself, then you stand at the threshold of real transformation. Not the kind that promises to fix you, but the kind that reveals you were never broken. The question is no longer whether you will heal your inner child, but whether you have the courage to let that child dissolve completely into the vastness of who you're becoming. Whether you're ready to stop being a victim of your past and start being the author of your future. This requires a different kind of bravery than what the healing industry celebrates. Not the courage to feel your feelings or speak your truth, but the courage to let go of the very identity you've built around your wounds. To stop being the person who was hurt and start being the person who creates. Write this in the comments as your declaration of independence from the past. I release the child who never was to become the adult I am called to be. But understand, this is not just words. This is a ritual of transformation. A sacred commitment to stop living from your wounds and start living from your power. When you write those words, you're burning the bridges back to the familiar territory of victimhood and stepping into the unknown country of authentic selfhood. This is not a healing, this is a resurrection. Not a return to innocence, but a journey into authentic power. Not the recovery of what was lost, but the discovery of what was always there, waiting beneath the rubble of conditioning and compromise. The wounded child was never your truth. It was your training ground, your initiation into the mysteries of human suffering and resilience. And now the training is complete. Now you can graduate from being a survivor to being a creator. Step into the silence that creates worlds. Step into the darkness that births stars. Step into the terrifying freedom of being exactly who you are, without apology, without explanation, without the need for anyone's permission or approval. The child is dead. Long live the adult you're becoming. In the comments below, make your commitment. Then watch the next video in this series where we explore what happens when you stop trying to fix yourself and start creating yourself from scratch. Where we dive into the practical steps of building a life that honors who you really are, not who you were conditioned to be. The universe is waiting for your emergence. Your authentic self is calling from the future, beckoning you forward into a life beyond healing, beyond recovery, beyond the limitations of your past. The only question is, are you ready to stop healing and start living?